Okay, how's the sound this morning? The cheap seats? Good? Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. O Lord, form our hearts, transform our minds, conform our wills to yours. And as they say in the Orthodox Church, let us be attentive. Now, is there anybody here today who was not here yesterday for either session? Okay, well, welcome. Last night we were talking about change, the story of change, especially the kind of change that involves seeing differently, because Lent is a season designed for our discomfort, we said, so don't get too comfortable in these lovely pews of yours. None of us likes to think we're not seeing clearly. That's where the discomfort comes in. We don't think that we should have to change our minds, hearts, or opinions about everything or anything. We have opinions because we like them. That's why we have them. But we're asked to change. So we're going to be talking today about the story of power. And so I'm going to give a little demonstration to the men because the women don't need this, but the men do. I am playing a power game with you right now. I am wearing what is known as the little black dress, the little black structured dress. Everybody knows there's more than one kind. This is the little black structured dress. This is the power dress. This is the dress that tells you I'm in charge. This is my show. I have the microphone. And don't mess with Texas. But I put a cardigan on top of it. And everybody knows that Mr. Rogers wears the cardigan. So I want you to be my neighbor. And I'm soft and gentle, and you don't have to be afraid of me. But then, I have the belt, the silly belt. And the silly belt tells you this game that I'm playing with clothes is really a game. That this is not a power game, this is not a pretend game, this is just a game. And so ignore the clothes. But we're all playing power games with our clothes. And now I'm going to take this off because I really am serious. This is my show. Okay, we're going to start by considering the power of words because we know all about the power of clothes. In the beginning was the Word, John's Gospel tells us. So that makes words among the oldest forms of power in the world. And we know this from the playground. We learned a little chant about words when we used to say, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me." One of the earliest lies of childhood, because of course it is clearly not true. Chanting this phrase about the harmlessness of names is just an attempt to shield ourselves from the bullies, right? Because in fact, names do cause great harm. They start fistfights at every age. I remember being in an airport bar in Houston where a fistfight broke out because one man called the other man a Democrat. Don't do that in Texas. Or, consider the moment we keep hearing about in the news when Will Smith hauled off and socked Chris Rock at the Academy Awards last year. Words alone were the provocation. Chris Rock did not throw the first punch physically, but still, there was a punch. So names start fights, words start fights. They also raise interior welts and scars that can last us a lifetime. You all know adults who will tell you the story of those wounding words verbatim across a lifetime, the things that were said to them by their parents, by their teachers, by important people. Because the words still hurt, and that's why they remember them. Each of us probably remembers something that somebody said to us along the way that hurt us. We were called lazy, stupid, clumsy, fat. Hard words. I can still see clearly the words that were always scrawled across my report cards by teachers in large red letters. Inconsistent application. Doesn't try hard enough. The story of my life. Or it became the story of my life because it was written in such large red letters next to my name. And this is the problem with words. They can become branding irons, seared into our self-understanding, even if the words aren't true. They still stay with us. They're hard to shake once they're attached to us. And some words are so insulting, they can't be spoken in polite society, or there will be fights. The wise among us learn from an early age to choose our words carefully, because the power in words earns our respect. Now, we know not everybody uses the spoken word with care. Our society is littered with vulgarities, and they're everywhere, and stereotypes as well. And the stereotypes are meant to ignite strong emotions in us. So the media headlines are chosen not to tell us the truth, not to tell us what's going on, just to garner our eyeballs, that's all. And in advertising, words will play upon our desire, our greed to possess and consume. And the flippant words that our politicians use all across the board are meant to arouse our indignation. They want to get the blood up. Fiery words will produce a state of alarm so that we're going to seek assurances in reliable corners. They want us to be upset so that we will rely on them. But how often do we hear a word that rouses us to life in all of its beauty, in all of its possibility? In the beginning was such a word, we're told. And that word had power, more power than any other word ever spoken, because that word called every possibility into being. God says, let there be light and land and life itself. And whatever God speaks, of course, comes into being and is sublimely good. So the word initially takes form and becomes a world. And anybody here who's ever heard the words, I love you, spoken to them, knows how much words can matter, how they can thrill us to life. And in the Gospels, we're told that words can bring a dead man out of a tomb. It can make a paralyzed person get up and dance. Words have a kind of marvelous authority over our lives. So let me ask, why did you come here this morning? Not for the free food. There's no free food. You came to hear something, that's all. Words will be spoken here this morning, lots of them, 6,000 if you want to know. It's extraordinary that folks will come out of their homes to hear words, because our society is just littered with words, on billboards, on magazines, in the news, words, the crawl at the bottom of the news programs. Our society is littered with ugly, hope-stealing words. And so perhaps we come together in a place like this because we're looking for better words. Maybe you were hoping this morning for more hopeful words. But we're so bombarded by words that committing our heart to the right word becomes important. Certain words always root down in each generation and become sort of the theme song of the generation. In the 1950s, we were told Greece was the word. I don't know whether or not that was true. But peace was the word in the 1960s for sure, as we were battling down the Vietnam War. And me was the word, the mantra of the 80s for sure. And then came the recession, so, maybe greed wasn't so good after all. But then came, after the recession, 9/11, right? And the critical word suddenly became security. Security. Politicians are in the business of words. They make it their business to find the right word to capture the mood of the nation, as concisely as possible. So they'll say, it's the economy, stupid, or make America great again. Because they know that if they find the right word, the right phrase, the word that captures the popular imagination, they win the prize. And the prize might be something valuable, like market share, or consequential, like an election. So I wonder, what will the big word be in 2023? In this world full of words that can wound or heal, investing in the right word is critical. Words shock us out of complacency, they move us to tears, they motivate us to act. It's why preachers spend so much time on their homilies. I mean, I'm listening to Father Praveen all these mornings and listening to Father Pat. They spend so much time trying to find the right words that are going to motivate their people to do what the gospel says, to capture their hearts and set them on fire. We come to church on Sunday sometimes thinking, I just don't care about all this today. And then suddenly, because of a rousing word or a hymn lyric, suddenly we do care. Suddenly we do become very invested. We may have been saying, I'm just not giving myself away anymore to anybody. I am guarding my heart. As Barbara Streisand says, my heart belongs to me. But suddenly, because of a well-chosen word that we hear in the liturgy, we find ourselves resolving, well, maybe I will. Or even, yes, we must. We must. After all, Jesus didn't die on the cross so that Catholics could go to Mass on Sunday. I hope you know this. Jesus died to save a world. So we're either in the process of being saved, we're either part of the saving act, or truly we are wasting our lives. So we find that all of us, in fact, are in the word business. Teachers, preachers, certainly, catechists, yes. Politicians and diplomats, obviously. Salespeople, for sure. Media workers all over the map. But spouses and parents are in the word business too, although they may be less aware of it in those roles. But every time we offer words of hope to a friend, anytime a lover wants to win the heart of the beloved, the words matter. Because we learn that if we get the words right, we're on our way to getting everything right. But consider what happens if you choose the wrong word. The prophets were acquainted with this. I mean, just think about Jeremiah being dropped into the muddy cistern, or being banished like Amos, or losing your head like John the Baptist. Now, words are a perilous business sometimes. Forget sticks and stones. There's nothing harmless at all about words. They are bullets being used back and forth across our country. That's why the first thing every dictator does is lock up the reporters, the speech makers, the bloggers, the social networkers. And they knew this even back in the 19th century when a playwright said that the pen is mightier than the sword. And that makes TV and Twitter an endless supply of ammunition. So we're all in the word business. In family life, we know that words can make a situation so much better or so much worse. We can say, not now, to a child, or we can say, sure, come here. And it makes all the difference in the world of that child. You can just watch their face fall or lift up. A lifetime of not now, not you, that can disintegrate hope. So the words we choose have a tremendous authority over the people that we care about, and we have to be careful with the way we use our words. And all of this is true of human words, so how much more then does the divine word matter in the word? Does the divine word have authority in this world? God's word creates the world, we know in the Genesis story, and the word has the power to save the world in the person of Jesus. And God's word continues to transform the world as we listen to the long old story of our faith every Lent. So reading the Bible, especially getting involved in Bible study, as I know many of you are, reading the Bible, we're not kidding around. We're playing with fire. We're playing with cosmic fire. And we might get burned, like Moses did when he stood before that burning bush that wasn't consumed. That fire continued to burn in Moses without consuming him for the next 40 years as he led the people through the wilderness. And that fire raged in Jeremiah. He speaks of it when he says, the word is like fire in my heart, imprisoned in my bones. I grow weary holding it in, and I cannot. And then in all the portraits we see of Pentecost, each one of the people present in the room is with a little flame on top of their heads like matchsticks blazing. So you and I are also invited to become living torches in the world, to illuminate the darkness of our world, because Jesus didn't die on the cross so that Catholics could go to Mass on Sunday. And if words are this powerful, then let's please take seriously the power of stories, the stories we tell, the stories we pass around in social media. Stories can inform us, they can deform us, they can transform us. But we get to choose the stories that we tell. Which means that the stories that you and I claim as true and move around in our culture, in our conversations, those stories that we claim as true wield more power in this world than all the guns and bombs and governments. The question is, do we believe this? Do we take them that seriously? But they do. That's why our church is in the storytelling business, because stories have power, stories matter. Nothing matters more than the story to which you give your heart. Stories told in Russia started a war with Ukraine. Stories told in Hollywood, Washington, in newsrooms, on the internet, they all have great influence over us. They can make a regime invincible or topple it. Stories rule, and leaders know this. So when a narrative changes, for example, the political narrative about the necessity of a particular war, when we suddenly start hearing where the enemies lie, pay attention to that, because they're trying to move us in a direction to act. And is that really the direction we want to go? But also our personal narratives can shift. There's a point in every marriage where people are either saying, let's keep on doing this, or this isn't worth our trouble. When the narrative shifts, everything changes. So I repeat, stories wield more power in this world than guns and bombs, and that's why governments that have guns and bombs do everything they can to control the story too. They have to, because stories matter. Stories tell people who they are, and people who know who they are will act on that understanding. So consider the old story about a woman named Myrtle who accompanies her husband Harry to a routine doctor's appointment. Has anybody heard this one? So the doctor examines Harry, then he sends him out and beckons for Myrtle to come into his office. And after she's seated, the doctor says, the situation with your husband is grave. Harry's under a great deal of stress. If he doesn't remain in a good frame of mind, he's headed for serious trouble. So here's what I recommend. When Harry gets up in the morning, make him a warm breakfast. Show interest in his plans for the day. And if you should call during the day, listen to him with enthusiasm, be supportive. When he gets home at night, prepare all of his favorite foods, rub his shoulders, invite him to watch the game on TV. And if he's interested in romance later, be receptive and warm. And if you take good care of your husband in this way, we should be able to avert this health crisis. Well, Myrtle is stunned. She leaves the doctor's office and she wanders out to the car with her husband, and Harry asks her anxiously, so what did the doctor say to you? She says, Harry, I'm afraid he said you're going to die. Well, the doctor didn't exactly say that, but it's what Myrtle hears, right? Because she can't imagine making the changes that the doctor is asking her to make. She hears her husband's prognosis through her own story, and the hopeful message gets lost somewhere in translation. But how each of us hears a story has less to do with the storyteller's intent than the story that you and I are already living. I mean, just imagine the times that you've gone to a movie with a friend and you loved the movie because it was so positive, and your friend hated it because it was so sappy. Well, the soft heart and the cynic go to the same movie, but they hear a different story. And the cynic will call herself a realist, call the soft heart a patsy, but a cynic is only a realist when reality is to be despaired of. And despair, we know, is not a gospel value. So in the story of Myrtle despairs of Harry's fate only because she's unwilling to make the changes in light of what she hears. And this is true for us in church too. Too often the failure of a living word to rouse our hearts has less to do with communication. It's not a failure of communication. It's a failure of imagination. So let's take a poll here right now this morning. How many of you are going to change your lives this Lent? Maybe. Maybe we will, if the change isn't too drastic. Because like our friend Myrtle, some changes are just too large to consider. So the power of a story only goes as deep as we're open to receiving that story. And that's true whether it's the gospel or the story on the evening news. But if we're not open to the authority of a story to transform us, my recommendation is that we stop going to church. Because church is a very dangerous place for us if we are resistant to change. Change is the name of the game in this building. So don't come here if you're not going to change. Preachers will tell you, there's really only one homily. They give it every single time. It's the invitation to change. And the rest is up to us. Either we change or nothing changes. So we can storm heaven from now until doomsday with our prayers, but unless we are willing to change, nothing changes. Now, some time ago, I was at a fancy dinner party. I was seated next to a man who seemed to be enjoying our conversation until I mentioned that I was a Catholic. Obviously disgusted by this revelation, he snorted, "Don't you know that Christianity is a religion for losers?" And I said, "Yes, it is. Christianity is a religion for losers, but the difference is you think that's an insult. I think that's the good news." Christianity, our good news, is for the losers, for the poor, the sick, the meek, the persecuted and despised, the condemned. So Jesus establishes a religion for the losers. So for those of us who count on winning, what Jesus has to say is useless, even ridiculous. And we hear the story of Jesus from deep within our personal stories. We can't help that. So to the extent that our story bears sin's distortion, we can only hear the gospel message through that distortion, only through the static of our own inner noise. So it's our responsibility to clean up the static in our lives so that we can hear clearly. Because our pride, as Father was saying at Mass today, our pride will always reject the idea that we are among the losers, that we are invited to participate and share in the destiny of the losers. We don't want to hear that the Beatitudes are merit badges for the world's losers. Even though we follow the Lord of loss clearly, you and I don't want to lose. We want to win. So we justify, we rationalize who we are, all the warts on our lives, all the compromises we make to our integrity. We don't seek conversion because that's the way of weakness, not success. And we all want success. We all want to win. Me, I want this talk to succeed. I would be lying to you if I said I hope to face your disdain at the end of this hour. We follow the Lord of failure, nailed to a cross, yet you and I hope to succeed. So how in this world, can we be Christian? How can we follow a meek Lord when you and I are addicted to power? So we have to meditate on power, what it means, where it comes from, what it's for. Power is fundamental in every generation, in every story. Every story is a story about power. If you remember nothing else I say this week, every story is a story about power. Think about what you watch, whether you watch TV or Netflix, the movies you see in the theater. Doesn't matter whether you're into cop shows or zombie movies, or sporting events, or video games, or reality shows, or romantic comedies, or presidential campaigns, or the Oscars, which are coming up. They're all about power. Who has it, who doesn't? Who wins, who loses? That's the story. It's the only story there is as long as human beings are involved. Our personal stories are about power too. At work, at home, in our marriages, in family networks, in school, church, government, power is always being wielded. And depending on how it's used, there are always winners and losers in even our most sacred relationships. So we have to ask ourselves, what makes a person powerful? In any given story, the factors may be different. Armies, wealth make you powerful. Celebrity, knowledge, wisdom, beauty. The ability to inspire fear makes you powerful, but also the ability to inspire trust. So the most important question becomes, what do we do with the power we have? Too frequently, we use power for two reasons: to help ourselves or to harm others. And that's a problem. The last question we might ask is, what should we do with power? What does God do with power? And the Bible is full of answers to that question. The Bible has a lot to say about the divine use of power, which is why it's a mistake to say that we shouldn't be talking about power in church at all. We may prefer that religion confine itself to talk about meekness and humility, which are very important subjects in the life of the church. We might say that power should be talked about out there in the world. Leave that to the worldly. But clearly that's not a good strategy if you just look outside those doors. Now, look what happens when the worldly are in charge of the power. Power is a biblical matter. It's a gospel issue. It's at the heart of the season of Lent, because we know where the story is going. As we said, it's going to the Passion. Jesus arrives in this world originally as the divine Son. He's the world's greatest superpower. And what does the world's greatest superpower doing with all the power in the universe? He lays it down. He puts it at the service of the poor, the meek, the sick, the unloved, the unwelcome, the stranger. So the world's greatest superpower empties himself of his divinity, as St. Paul says, and takes up the terrible vulnerability of our reality. First bottle. Okay, so Jesus, the world's greatest superpower, empties himself of divinity, takes on our humanity. By worldly standards, Jesus is a chump. Jesus has it all, and he gives it all away. Who here will do such a thing? Show of hands, please. Jesus surrenders his entire privilege as the divine Son for the sake of sinners, losers, the worst people possible. What is he, crazy? We call ourselves disciples, but we don't want to follow Jesus there. We don't want to follow Jesus in giving all our power away. We don't want to follow Jesus in giving any of our power away. We cling to our privilege, to whatever corner of dominance we possess. We're going to wear the structured dress. How else will we be safe? How else can we protect what belongs to us? And we'll see the power game relentlessly throughout our culture. It's going to play out in traffic later today, and on the parish council, and in checkout lines at the supermarket. Power is about getting our opinions heard in the average conversation. Who's louder, or who has the microphone? All the way down to who controls the TV remote and the thermostat on the average night at home. It's all about power. And the more powerless you and I feel, the more aggressive we get about expressing our need for dominance. When people feel most powerless, they're going to shout louder. They're going to push and punch. They'll even shoot guns into crowds of strangers to make their point. They'll strap bombs to their bodies and blow themselves up. That's how crucial our desire to be in control is. How crucial it is for you and me to acknowledge our desire for power. But I want to say, power's not bad. You know, power is a good thing. Power is an attribute of God. Everything good in the world was created through the divine use of power. God is the Almighty, the Omnipotent, the source of all power. So like everything else in creation, power is meant to be the ultimate good. God uses power to create, restore, save, sanctify. But what Jesus chooses to do with his power, with all the power in the universe, is disturbing to us. Just look at the crucifix. That is a countercultural, strange design. No, in this world, power doesn't choose to do this. But in Jesus' mind, this is the only use for all that authority that he has. We're certainly not going to choose the cross. St. Paul recognizes that it's a stumbling block to people of faith. He calls it the primary stumbling block to faith. And yet Paul insists on preaching Christ crucified anyhow. So that the God of the universe chooses to get nailed to a cross is still the biggest obstacle to faith anywhere. It's the biggest obstacle to our faith, to really trusting in God. Because this is no way to get ahead. Jesus doesn't use power the way we do to climb up. He takes everything that's his, which is everything, and he reaches down. So the whole world is designed to be upwardly mobile, and Jesus Christ is downwardly mobile. And we reject this wholeheartedly, even as we sit in our pews with our hands folded like good Catholics. But this is it, folks. At the heart of human history is an inconceivable event, the death of God's Son. Of all injustices ever dared, this wrong is most wrong. This is absolute power on display at the center of history, choosing absolutely to surrender all of its privilege. And we know it didn't have to be this way because we've been here for the first Sunday of Lent when Jesus here's the devil's bargain. When the devil says, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. The angels will catch you. And Jesus does throw himself down and lets his enemies catch him. I mean, Jesus could have gone to Gethsemane to order reinforcements. Dear God, send troops of angels, a bunch of swords, and maybe a plague of boils on that crowd that's coming to get me. Jesus had reason to fear for his personal safety, but he would not allow one sword to be raised in his defense. It's crazy. The Jesus way is crazy by worldly standards. The passion of Jesus makes no sense at all in a society like this one. It directly contradicts all of our values. Jesus doesn't seek greatness. And nobody's going to wear a hat that says, "Make America meek again." No way. As Franciscan Father Richard Rohr says, the more we have, the more we have to protect. That's the problem. And you and I have a lot to protect. That's the problem. So we react to any perceived threat against us or against our stuff with violence. But Jesus is different. Jesus refuses to become a man of violence, even when violence is all around him, even when the violence is directed toward him. Jesus refuses to be shaped by events. Instead, he shapes history itself by wielding the greatest power there is, which turns out to be the divine love that's inside of him. And we say, love? What kind of power is love? Love sounds so weak to us. But St. Paul spells it out in 1 Corinthians. You know this by heart. Love is not coercive. It doesn't insist on having its own way. Love is persuasive. Love is an invitation. And if love fails to persuade us, if it will not soften our hearts, well, love remains faithful even to death on a cross. The power of love will not give in to fear, even though there's plenty to fear. The Bible says, in fact, perfect love casts out fear. Henry Nouwen once told me, these are the only 5 words from the Bible you need to memorize. Perfect love casts out fear. For love's sake, Jesus will not make the mad dash for his own personal security with a coercive use of force. Instead, history's greatest superpower chooses to answer evil with good. And that's why Jesus chooses to forgive his enemies, not after they repent of their wrongdoing, not after they change, not after they say they're sorry. Jesus chooses to forgive his enemies even while they're about the business of killing him. And that scares me. That even maybe offends me a little, because you and I are not going to do this. And if you recommend this use of power at your next dinner party, be prepared. The response will be unpleasant. People will wonder about your loyalty to your family. Your patriotism will be questioned. Because here's the truth. Violence is our way, and we're not going to give it up. Radical ideas like the ones that Jesus was espousing could get a person killed. They got Jesus killed. And then that begins the kickstart of all the deaths. You know, Stephen, James, Peter, and Paul, the bulk of the 12, the entire legacy of martyrs all through history. Laying down our power, we recognize, is a dangerous thing to do. You know, if the goal is to preserve our life, it's a dangerous thing to do, to put away your sword. And saving our lives is really what we're all about. We know darn well that the people who seek power in this world are never going to follow us in that surrender. If we put down our swords, we're sitting ducks. So all the Pilates in the world, and the Herods and the Caiaphases, the wealthy, the well-positioned, the treacherous ones, they're not going to give up their advantage just because we surrender ours. That's what happens when you do that. So the bottom line is, if saving our skin is what we're about, Christianity is probably the wrong religion for us. Now, if a God of dominance is what we really want, if we want to be safe, then we have to find a religion with bull worship at its center. And I believe Wall Street has one. The bull is the ancient icon of dominance. We don't have a bull at the center of our religion. The icon at the center of our religion is a man dying on a cross. Christianity is a religion for losers. It's for people who buy the crazy-sounding idea that the only way to save our lives is to lay them down. And when I think about this, when I think about losing life and saving life, I always come back to my friend Dale. And all of you, except for one, has heard my original story of Dale last night. So let me just say that Dale and I were great friends, classmates back in seminary in the 1980s. Dale was the sort of person you never forget. He was smart, he was funny, he was disarming. Disarming. He put his sword down. He championed the underdog. So if you were the oddball, if you were unlovable, Dale was your best friend. He was the kind of guy who would rummage through the office wastebasket and find a discarded bouquet of flowers from someone's desk, and he would extract the single blossom that was still intact, and he would say, "See, this one can be saved," and plunk it into a vase. It gave him real joy to save a half-dead flower. Well, Dale and I were casual friends during our years studying theology. The lay students were small, and so we hung out together. But when Dale and I wound up at the seminary years later, this time as colleagues, the theology got more personal for us because it wasn't long before Dale got sick. Only a few weeks before Dale's world came apart, he and I had met for breakfast, and he seemed fine. That morning he told me he had plans to climb Mount Kilimanjaro to celebrate his upcoming birthday. He was in his 60s. Well, this was Dale all over. You know, I knew he wasn't kidding. He was a traveler, he was an adventurer, he was an athlete. I had never known anyone so vigorous and so alive. So if he was going to climb Mount Kilimanjaro for his 60-something birthday, he was going to do it. But the next time I saw Dale, he was in the ICU. He was wired and monitored, unable to speak, the left side of his body paralyzed by a stroke, and all of this, including a tumor in his brain that was certainly going to kill him. And it wasn't clear how much time he had left. It wasn't even clear if he knew what was happening to him. Unless somebody took responsibility for Dale, nothing else would be done for him. He was going to be left to die untreated. And as I looked down on my friend in that hospital bed, I had the sudden memory of him holding up that drooping, rescued flower from the wastebasket. See, this one can be saved. And this is how the psalmist describes you and me. We are grass that springs up in the morning, and by evening we wither and fade. Some of us faster than others. Yet you and I too can be rescued, even from death, even from sin. All is not lost, even on those days when it feels like we are lost. I think Catholics have the advantage because we spend a lifetime looking up at crucifixes. Traditionally, Catholics hung a crucifix in every room of their houses, and you can go home today and see if you can find one in every room in your house. It's a good tradition. Because displaying the cross is not about piety. Believe me, I don't have a pious bone in my body, but I have a cross in every room in my house, and a picture of Mary too. But it's a memento mori, the cross. That's Latin for a reminder of death. It's the sign that we're dust. And some orders of monks used to even sleep in their coffins at night to remind themselves that they were dust. I do not recommend this practice. You know, I'm the princess in the pea. But the cross is enough, I think. If you have a cross on your wall, you'll remember. And I'm going to digress for a minute and talk about this cross. When I used to get up to give talks, I would just wear a structured black dress because I was scared and I wanted them to know I was in charge. But after a parish mission I gave out in the desert, a priest came up to me afterwards and he said, I love the dress, but where's your insignia? And I said, oh, I'm not a nun. I said, no, I'm not a nun. I don't have any insignia. He said, where's your insignia, your insignia, your insignia? And he took this cross off his neck and he put it on mine. He said, I just bought this in Poland. He said, it's amber and silver. He said, it was really expensive. He said, I even have a certificate for you to tell you what this is. Don't lose it. He said, he said, I bought it for myself, and I thought, I don't wear jewelry. What in the world am I buying this for? He said, I bought it for you, turns out. So here you go. Your insignia. This is who we are. It reminds us who we are. It tells us that as distracting, as engaging as the world may be, this isn't it for us. You know, we're moving on from here. Southern writer Flannery O'Connor said it best when she said, the task of every Christian is to prepare their own death in Christ. So, that's what we're here for. Life is not about getting our act together. Life is about getting our death together. So let's do it. This is the season for it. Now, everybody has their own method about how to get their death together. Francis of Assisi had his. He threw everything he owned out the window. You and I are probably not going to do that. Maybe you will. I won't. It worked for Francis. It doesn't even work for most Franciscans I know these days. They live quite well. But what should we be doing with our power if we're not doing that? Keep in mind what Jesus does with his power, with all the power in the universe. Jesus chooses to bend low to pick others up. He gives himself to the overlooked, the unimportant, the fragile, the despised. One of the last acts that he performs in this world is to wash the feet of friends who are going to abandon him. And then he accepts death on a cross. But it's not just death that we see on a cross. Jesus didn't just die of natural causes up there. And Calvary is not a tragic accident. Wish it wouldn't have happened. The death of Jesus is ordered. a deliberate decision on the part of powerful people. This is important for us to realize. But what am I saying? Is this a murder then? Is there a murder at the center of our religion? No. No, because Jesus was legally put to death. He was executed, which means religion and state chose to crucify him. All the right people signed on for this. The crucifixion, is statecraft. It's what institutional religion does when it's up and running. It's the people's tax dollars at work. Execution is a far cry from murder. We need to understand the difference because everybody walks away with clean hands from an execution. The last word on the subject of Jesus is he got what he deserved. And this frightens me. I hope it frightens you just as much to imagine that the crucifixion is not a symbol of something that went terribly awry in history's story. This is neither an accident nor a mistake. It's not a tragic story. It is an ordinary institutional response to a problem. It removes an obstacle from a community. It punishes an enemy. The cross is a convenient solution. So we have to reckon with a terrible fact. There is a crucified man at the center of our worship every time we come together, which makes our religion the wrong place to seek false assurances that everything in this world is unfolding the way it should. We would like to believe that. It clearly is not. What our religion does tell us through the sign of the cross is that it points us in the direction that leads us out of the madness. We have to lay our power down. We can't be violent people anymore. The cross directs us through the dark. It opens a door through death itself. Now, we didn't have to choose the cross. There were plenty of other primary symbols we could have put at the center of our religion. A good shepherd, a wise guru, a radiant miracle man. We could have hung those images in our churches, but we chose the cross. It's the intersection between worldly and heavenly authority. It's the great and conclusive comparison between the right and the wrong use of power. We put Jesus on the cross. He chooses to be there. Because it's in the sign of the cross, as St. Paul tells us, that power reaches perfection. Power reaches perfection here. What motivates God to do such a thing? Well, Christianity claims that love is the culprit here. It's God's passion for us that makes salvation history not only possible, but also necessary from God's perspective. And this word passion is very curious. It comes up every Lent. Passion describes love and devotion. Also describes anguish and suffering. Agony. That's a strange double duty for a word. Love and devotion, suffering and agony. You know, passion is the expression of our greatest desires for our lover, for our child, for the cause that we believe in. But it also means anguish, something that any sane person would avoid at all costs because of how vulnerable we are and how very much life can hurt. Now, a Methodist friend of mine told me about the day that she brought her little boy for the first time into a Catholic church. Methodists use the cross, they do not use the crucifix. So upon entering the building, at once they were confronted by an enormous crucifix in the vestibule of the church, and the little boy was paralyzed by the sight. The mother realized he had never seen a cross with the body of Jesus still on it. So she let her son stare at the crucifix for a good long while in silence. Finally, the boy turned to his mother with tears standing in his eyes, and he said, "What happened? What happened?" The question is not surprising. That we don't ask this question is surprising. We've grown used to the cross, the unspeakable suffering, the powerful love and compassion in the cross. We walk by crucifixes all the time and don't even see them. But that's the real answer to the question, what happened here? What happened here is that what was meant to be a sign of condemnation is transfigured into the signature of our salvation. So the worst thing possible becomes the best thing imaginable. Only the passion of God could make such a transformation possible. The cross is the intersection of love and suffering, because love always suffers for love's sake. Love is willing to suffer. Now, I'm not saying love is about suffering, and if you're in a miserable relationship, that's a whole different story. Love is not about suffering, but love is willing to suffer for love's sake. It's true of you in all of your primary relationships. You suffer for your children. You suffer with your parents. You suffer with your spouse. You suffer for your friends. The Bible assures us that love triumphs over suffering, so of the two kinds of passion, love is the stronger than death, stronger than hell. This is the great truth of Christianity. We answer the question, what happened? With the happiest of conclusions. Love happens here. And my friend Dale revealed this to me very powerfully in the last months of his life. He showed me how love can be stronger than death. Because before his stroke, Dale and I had been doing theology for a living, but after his stroke, we found ourselves doing theology to make sense of what we were living. Our days were filled with cancer treatments and stroke rehab. In the months after his diagnosis, we had to pass through 5 hospitals and 2 nursing homes in 4 different cities. And each stage of his treatment for each of his conditions required a change of scenery, and at one point Dale was assigned to a hospital ward with several other men in it. And when I came to visit him the next day, before entering his room, the social worker at the hospital intersected me, and she said, "You're here for Mr. Gilson? We thought you might want to move him to another room." I said, "Why? What's he done? What could he possibly do?" "Nothing," she said. "It's just that the other 2 men in his room are, well, they're dying." Well, I said, "Mr. Gilson is expected to die." And she said, "But the other men are actively dying. It might have a depressing effect on Mr. Gilson to be in there." So I said, "Well, I don't like to make decisions for Dale that he can make for himself, so let's go ask him what he wants to do. Although I think I know what he's going to say." So the social worker followed me to Dale's bedside, and I put the question to him. I said, "Dale, they're thinking you might want to be moved to another room because the other 2 men in here are dying." Well, Dale looked at me like I had 2 heads. He said, "But I'm dying." I said, "Yes, but not quite as fast as they are." And I'll never forget his answer. I mean, there's my poor friend lying in this hospital bed, bald and burned from radiation. He's half paralyzed by the stroke. His memory and his speech are permanently impaired. And he looks up at me and he says, "But if these men are dying, don't you think we're needed here?" Well, the social worker looked from Dale to me with something between awe and horror. "Who are you people?" she said. And before we could answer, she spoke more urgently. She said, "Tell me something. Tell me what love is. I've never met anybody who knows any more about it than I do, but I suspect people like you might know." And of course, I'm the one without brain damage, right? I can't think of a single thing to say to this woman. I work at a seminary. I teach ministry. I teach homiletics. I've worked in the church for a dozen years at this point, and I have no idea what to say to this woman to explain to her what love is. But Dale was absolutely serene in the face of the question. He looks up from his bed and he says, "Love is patient. Love is kind." And so with his cueing me, I was able to read to the social worker the rest of Paul's marvelous statement. So I invite you to imagine lying on a bed from which you will never rise, and yet believing and fastening your heart to these amazing words from St. Paul. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious, boastful, arrogant, or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Because love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. So you and I might ask ourselves, if these words were all we had, would they be enough? Would they sustain us? And not just sustain us, but bring us joy. Because these are joyful words, and there's really no point in hoping and wishing that such a thing might be true for us someday, that we could believe in these words enough. If we're not going to start living it and choosing it right now. Because Dale was a man who lived eloquently, but there was nothing in his eloquent life that was as eloquent as his dying process. During all those months that I was caring for Dale, I kept thinking, gosh, this is the way to do it. I hope I remember. I hope I have a death like his. Dale's nurses and his orderlies, his therapists, were all reporting to me this remarkable experience of joy that they were having, taking care of him. You know, they're ministering to this man's very real suffering, and at the same time, Dale is being worn down to his essence, and his essence turns out to be a love so tangible that we were all caught up in it and found the joy in it. He was still holding up a flower rescued from the trash. He was showing us the beauty even in life's most fragile and vulnerable moments. And a death like this, folks, does not come to the lucky ones. Flannery O'Connor is right when she says the Christian task is to prepare our own death in Christ. If you know how you want to die, that's how you have to live. You and I are working on our death right here this morning. We hope to discover that love is our essence at the end. We have to make sure that love is our intention in every hour and every moment. Because, as we have learned through this pandemic, to live in a body is a perilous proposition. And yet God chose to do it. God chose to inhabit our dangerous reality because it's where we are, and that's what love does. Love bears all things, Paul says. Love aims for the beloved. And thanks be to God, love never fails. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.